According to a report from the Army Surgeon General, more than half of young troops serving in combat roles were attacked or ambushed. 70% experienced an IED explode nearby. 88% received incoming fire. David Litz, if you could just spell out for us a little bit, how adequate are the services when these veterans do return home, in terms of screening, in terms of mental health care?
Right. Well, toward the end of the last decade, I think the services got really to be quite focused on trying to screen the returning service members for problems that could lead to the worst possible outcome, which would be suicide. And the problem is most of those screenings occur right at the time when the military member really wants to reconnect with their family and loved ones. And so they know that if they kind of raise their hand and say, yes, I have some issues that need to be dealt with, that likely that would lead to delaying their reconnecting with those that they love. And so that's probably not the best time to reach them. It's probably also not the best time for them to really be aware that they have problems. Perhaps 4, 6, 8 weeks later is really the time, to get them to identify that they have issues that they could really use some professional help with.
And one of the things David Wood said earlier is that about half of those who do commit suicide weren't actually in combat. Can you just expand a little bit on that idea for us, David Litz? Because it seems counterintuitive. It seems intuitive to think that those who went to war and were deployed will suffer the consequences of that, emotionally, PTSD-wise and stuff. But for those who actually weren't exposed to combat, what's going on there?
Well, first of all, we have to consider that the majority of military members never see combat. So the people who go and are deployed to combat are a minority of the force. But for those, who have never been deployed or might be deployed but don't actually see combat, our military, regardless of how you serve, has been under a lot of stress over the last 10 years or more. Even people working stateside are working long hours under very highly stressful conditions. Some of them stateside are actually exposed to the trauma of war, but at a distance. Some of them are looking at war through satellite images. Some of them are exposed to the outcomes of war by processing bodies that come into our mortuary. So there's a lot of ways of being stressed, I would say, by being in the military now that other than going to Afghanistan or Iraq or someplace in combat. This stress all adds up, and we have a lot of people at risk because of living with these stressors for a long time now.
Yeah, and when we're talking about stress, we also have to take into account the fact that we have been a nation at war for a decade now, and so that ultimately does contribute to the national psyche, I think. But David Litz, the fact that deployments are now declining, does that mean that we'll see the number of at-risk military personnel at risk of suicide decline as well? Well,
there's a couple of things going on here. One is I think we're throttling back, obviously, on our war effort. So there's going to be fewer people exposed to war, fewer people exposed to the repeated and long deployments. On the other hand, we have a military in transition, and so we're going to have a lot of people who were planning on continuing to serve longer, finding themselves in a force that's being downsized. And so what they were looking forward to in the future perhaps is not going to be there in terms of there will probably be people who were, who will be put out of the military before they want to be. So it's transition also brings on its own stresses. So where we'll see reduced risk related to combat and deployments, we may see some increased stressors and risk coming from the transition in the military.
Yeah. David Wood, there seems to be so much sometimes confusion and controversy over the numbers. I know just a number of weeks back we did a segment here about a study that came out. I think it was backed by the Pentagon that said that deployment is not a direct factor in terms of suicide. So there's also the idea that the military suicide rate has now surpassed the civilian suicide rate. But those numbers also seem to be disputed. Why is there so much confusion around this all?
Well, the big reason is that there's a stigma about suicide. People are very reluctant to talk about it. Even in the military, when someone takes his own life or dies by suicide, it can be very difficult to determine exactly what happened. For veterans, of course, there is no central registry of veterans. And so when someone dies by suicide who's been out of the military for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, it can be very hard to pin down exactly what happened. So we don't really know. One of the interesting things I found in trying to report this story was we don't really know how many people died by suicide each year. Even the number that's commonly cited, the 22 veterans per day, is a big estimate by the VA, and the margin of error is so big that it's really hard to say.